I'm Adelie Pojman-Ponte, and this is a special episode of Ukraine, the latest. It's a public holiday here in Britain, so today we thought we'd do something a little different, and we would answer your questions. You send many of them every day in the inbox, and we're always happy to read your messages. So today we've picked a few of them, and my colleagues Francis Dearnley, Executive Editor for Audio, and Dom Nicholls, Associate Editor for Defence, will try and answer them. Boys, no pressure. Are you ready?
Ready to go.
Okay. Before we start, I think you've got a little announcement for us.
Yes, we're releasing a new weekly newsletter where we answer more of your questions, and Dom and I will be offering some more exclusive insights about the war.
We're going to be bunging in a few maps and diagrams and bits and bobs like that, a few insights, analysis, a few recommendations maybe, books, beers, things coming up.
That sounds great. As long as I don't have to play referee between you two. That's great. You can sign up via the link in the episode description, and it's free for everyone. No subscription required. Let's dive into the first question then, shall we? Dom, this one's for you. It's from Eric in the US. If we accept that drones are orders of magnitude cheaper than tanks, at what point should we start evaluating a country's military spending on the kind of kit that they're buying versus the percentage of GDP?
Okay, thanks, Eric. Great question. So the evaluation of military capability is always a tricky and imperfect science. So GDP is a nice, easy, ready reckoner. We know what we're talking about with GDP. We can rate this year's GDP against last year's and 2 centuries ago, and et cetera, et cetera. So we kind of know what we are with GDP, but that only measures the input. It doesn't measure the output. So it doesn't show what you actually get for that money. And of course, that when you talk about defence, it's a blend of politics as well. As to when you use your defence, when you reach for the defensive toolbox and you're actually going to commit military forces. So we can look at what you've spent your money on. We can look at statements from defence ministers and prime ministers and presidents and what have you about what the national intent is or the national aspiration is, and then try and make a guess as to whether or not that actually matches up with what you've spent your money on. We can look at exercises that you do on your own or with allies. We can look at operations. If you're actually deployed somewhere, the difference between an exercise and an operation is exercise is preparing for it, and operation is actually doing it for real. So you can actually then get an idea as for how capable a military force is. And I suppose the best way of evaluating your military effectiveness is what effect does it have on your enemies and your adversaries? You know, are they deterred? You actually want your defence to deter someone from doing something such you then need to use your defence. When you're actually in a fight, you want it to defeat the other side. But you want to deter the other side to start off with. So as an example, let's have a look at the Baltic Sea. In the last few months, we've seen numerous examples of undersea cables being either cut mysteriously or cut by accident, with ships, tankers, dragging anchors, that kind of thing. So if we see that as malign activity, and I think we probably could, whoever was doing that clearly wasn't deterred by the presence of NATO shipping there or anyone else. You'll notice that NATO subsequently launched a big operation in the Baltic Sea exactly for this reason. And guess what? Since NATO has launched that, we haven't seen any undersea cables being cut by accident or by deliberate action and what have you. So, you can always measure what goes into a military force, and then you can rack it up on the whiteboard and work out how many tanks and ships and planes you've always got. That is easy to do, but it doesn't always give you the right answer. The right answer is what effect is left in the minds of your own people, but also, most importantly, any potential adversary.
Okay, thank you, Dom. So a lot of listeners have been sending thoughts and questions about the peace process. So Francis, there's several from you, but I've kind of boiled it down. Here's one from Nick from the British Virgin Islands. The US is threatening to walk away from the peace process. I would value your analysis on what this likely means if the threat is carried out. Do other countries have the ability and determination to keep Ukraine in the war if the US refuses to provide further assistance?
Well, thank you very much for your question. That's the multi-billion-dollar question. We just don't know the degree of resolve. The sense that we get from the so-called coalition of the willing at the moment is somewhat pessimistic about the prospects of a really robust and hawkish Europe if the Americans do start to withdraw from the continent. I think there are many of them that are hoping that deep down it won't come to that, and therefore they are, as it were, waiting to see what happens. When, of course, the danger is that if a decision is made very swiftly by Donald Trump, and we know that he can make very impulsive decisions, that Europe won't have the luxury of that time, and the ramifications of that would be extremely serious, because we would be in a situation where America could stop weapons support, and Europe would immediately being encouraged to fulfill that gap. The United States could also make it very difficult for Europe to do so if they, say, held back on certain contracts, refused to have it so that if, say, European countries bought weapons from the United States, that could then be given to the Ukrainians. They could bar that. So there are lots of unanswered questions, but really it boils down to the degree to which Europe has that resolve, to allude to the question, has that sense of resolve and moral clarity that it may well be obliged to act, not just for Ukraine's security, but for their own security. Because I think we need to be under no illusions here. This is, in Putin's Russia, a state that has become fascistic and overtly militaristic. And in those situations, if one looks at history, those states cannot easily stop. And so if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, which I don't think is perhaps likely in the short term, but if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, within a handful of years, most intelligence chiefs in Europe and beyond believe that there is a prospect of a renewed invasion. And maybe if the Americans are gone, there's no Article 5, it would be Latvia, it would be Lithuania next. And so this is a very, very serious time indeed. And Europe needs to act with the starkness of the facts in front of them.
A listener named Mark has got an excellent follow-up question for you. The coalition of the willing's momentum appears to have stalled, and even suggestions of UK troops on the ground, which were commonplace a couple of months ago, have been walked back. So what comes next?
Well, thanks, Mark. I mean, momentum stalled. We're very lucky these days that we've got 24-hour rolling news and instant commentary from people who profess to know what they're talking about. I mean, actually, things are moving reasonably quickly, but only because I would say since Trump's been in power, actually nothing much has shifted on the ground in Ukraine for a couple of years now. And in terms of the big political shifts, the question over how committed the US is, and therefore what anyone else, such as Europe, such as the coalition of the willing, may or may not have to do, that's only recently sort of really come into sharp focus. So I think we are somewhat, we have the luxury of having so much information at our fingertips, but I would caution against saying that the momentum has stalled. These are fresh and emerging ideas in a very difficult geopolitical landscape. Some of these, some very old contentions have been thrown out the window in a couple of years' time. Over the last couple of years, both in terms of the military effect on the ground, but also the politics. Some question marks over NATO. So these are really big things, and we would be wise not to rush to judgment. So I don't have a huge problem with people. And I know some of them, and I know they are sensible and considered people who will be thinking long and hard about this and talking to their peers and making sure that they are handling a very difficult situation the best way possible. So what comes next if the momentum stalled? Firstly, our question, as I say, whether or not the momentum has stalled. What comes next is a very, very difficult question to answer. I mean, either there's a if we allow Putin to dominate this narrative and that he's winning on the ground, which he is not, that he's inexorably moving towards Kyiv, which he is not, then there may be a very flawed and imperfect peace, and that is never a good place. I mean, I think something will come out of this. It might be more fudgy than clear cut and nice and shiny and perfect for the job at hand, but I think that given the facts on the ground and that Russia is an exhausted power militarily right now, I think eventually Europe will actually step up and do the right thing. A bit like the old Churchill criticism of America, that it will always do the right thing, having exhausted every other possibility. I think Europe might now be in that sort of zone. So I don't know is a short answer, but I would just caution against thinking it's been 2 weeks since we've heard anything about the coalition of the willing. It's all gone to rats. It probably hasn't. There is time here. There's nothing forcing this agenda. The lines aren't going anywhere. Politically, it is being driven by Trump and what he's going to say tomorrow, and then might change that next day. So I don't think there's any impetus right now to take early decisions that we might have to walk back later.
If I could just add one thought on that, I think we need to look very carefully at the Poles and the Germans particularly. These are countries that have pivotal roles potentially to play in any coalition of the willing, in terms for the Poles of the size of their armed forces, and for the Germans in terms of their procurement potential as Europe's foremost economy. Britain and France, our understanding is that they are willing to put potentially troops on the ground as a reassurance or a peace enforcement force if a ceasefire comes. Some would call for them to be more proactive and not wait for the ceasefire, but they have been willing to they put their neck out and said they are willing to do that. The Poles and the Germans have not, and they are going to be pivotal in these conversations, I think. One of those is going to have to shift into a more proactive stance if I think we're to really see the coalition of the willing have the clout that it may well need to ensure it has that deterrence effect for Russia.
Okay, really interesting. Dom, talking about troops on the ground, a lot of our listeners are really interested and curious about what the experience of soldiers is like on the front. What is the practical real life experience of war? So there are two questions for you. One is from Joshua in the UK. When a tank is hit, what is it like inside? If it's a mobility kill, or do they survive with damage? I heard you can still get a concussion. What's the protocol for withdrawal under fire, and what's it like to be in a tank in that situation? And then the second question is a logistics question from Gabriel. You've mentioned that one soldier on the front line has about 9 or 10 military personal assists. Could you go into more detail about what those roles are?
Okay, thanks, Joshua. Thanks, Gabriel. We'll come on to that in a minute. So luckily, I've no idea what it's like to be inside a tank when it's hit. Other than having a few small arms, as in rounds, hitting the outside of the turret. Thanks, infantry. No, it was... so what are we talking about here? Well, firstly, so a tank, if it's disabled in terms of the road wheels coming off or the tracks or what have you, so it can't move, that's called an M kill, a mobility kill. So if you fired an anti-tank missile, for example, and blew off the tracks, or so it literally can't move anywhere. That's good because the tank isn't going anywhere, but the turret's still functional, the gun. Right. So to actually totally destroy, or when a tank is totally destroyed, it's called a K kill, which is either, people say it's kinetic kill or just kill. But there's a difference between an M kill and K kill. So firstly, you've got to try and work out what we're talking about here. But actually inside a turret, if it's hit, now there's basically two types of munition that you'll be firing at a tank. The first one is basically just a big high explosive. So in this country we call it HESH, high explosive squash head. So the top of the round would literally squash against the belly of the vehicle it's hitting, to then the explosive behind it would have a larger surface area upon which to operate the squashed head bit. And what you're trying to do there is you're trying to put a blast wave into the turret. So if it's a soft-skinned vehicle, like just a truck or a car or something like that, then the actual high explosive might rip the thing apart and get inside and destroy everything in there. If it's a tank that could probably put up with a high explosive shell, this shock wave that goes through the turret, you're hoping that it will rip stuff off on the inside, all the radios and all the kit that's connected to the outside, give everybody inside a big headache, the concussion you're talking about there, or maybe damage or kill them with stuff flying around inside the turret. But generally, a high explosive shell against the most protected parts of a tank turret is not going to kill everyone inside. It might mean it's no longer functional because all the kit that allows the gun to fire might have broken, but actually it's just a great big shake and a lot of concussion and what have you. The other round is an armour piercing round, and again in this country we call them fin rounds, or fin for short, because it's APF SDS, the armour piercing fin stabilised discarding sabot round. So it's a dart, a depleted uranium dart, about 12 inches long, a couple of inches wide, that just goes so fast, and the sabot is the plastic shield around it that when it comes out of the barrel, so it's held straight inside the barrel, and when it comes out of the barrel of the tank, those sabots then fall away and just land on the ground, and then this dart flies. There's no explosive element to that dart. It's literally just depleted uranium or some other substance, a very, very, very dense metal, so that when it hits another target, a tank turret, it will go through the metal of the tank turret. Above 1,580 metres a second, it's called the hydrodynamic regime, whereby metals act like liquid. So basically, if you look at a tank turret that's been hit by a fin round, it's as if it's just like butter and you've just pushed a hot knife through it. The metal has just moved out of the way. It looks like liquid, and then it's obviously frozen again instantly, or, goes back to metal. But a fin round will get inside a tank turret, and it's then designed not only to penetrate a turret, but to perforate, so to go straight through and out the other side. And what happens is, because it's going so fast, there's actually, if you imagine there's actually a vacuum immediately behind the round, but just think about the amount of air pressure that is behind it. That pressure suddenly being introduced to a small turret and hopefully out the other side, that sudden increase in air pressure will increase the temperature, and that will generally create an explosion. So when you see a tank turret being blown off, it's not so much that there's rounds inside the turret that have ignited, although that is the case often with Russian tanks because they keep all the rounds in a carousel in the turret. But generally, it's the physical, as in the physics of this extremely high temperature suddenly introduced into that area where there's other bits and pieces like small pink bodies that would just suddenly go up in a massive great ball of flame. So fin rounds, like I say, have no explosive element to them whatsoever. It's like trying to get into your or get through a wall. If you walk up to a wall and punch it with your fists, nothing's going to happen except that you end up breaking your fingers. If you go and get on a motorbike and go at 100 miles an hour and hit the same wall, you'll probably get through it. That's just kinetic energy. So it's the same thing with a fin round. Kinetic energy will try and perforate that turret, and it so happens that because it's going so fast, you've got this increase in pressure behind the round, which then blows the turret off and probably sets lights at everything inside. We used not to worry about it too much when I was in tanks, because you will know nothing about that whatsoever. You also asked what the protocol is, Joshua, for being in that situation. Well, the protocol is to get out if you need to withdraw, get out in good order. So you don't just sort of turn tail and drive out of there as fast as possible, because that invites a rout and chaos. So you need to have one foot on the ground, i.e. some element of your forces static, looking at the enemy, maybe engaging the enemy, while the others are moving back, and then you sort of move back in stages. You always have one person or one tank or one company or what have you moving back, one element static facing the enemy, trying to hold them off while the other elements move back, and you sort of work your way back in that method. Tanks are very vulnerable, as you have identified, Joshua. They are so, armour is so dense. In order to put up with a fin round, and the front of a modern tank like a Challenger or a Leopard or an Abrams will put up with a fin round, but the armour has to be so dense in order to survive that it's so heavy. It's very, very heavy. You cannot put that amount of armour all over a tank, all over the turret, all over the hull. So essentially, the majority of the armour is on the bit of the tank that's going to face the enemy. Now, where is that? Traditionally, when we had two lines and we'd run at the other line, and they were the baddies over there and we were the goodies, you knew where the enemy was. If you stand on the top of a tank turret, if the barrel is over the front of the hull, and you put your arms out in that kind of angle, that's about 60 degrees. That's where the armour is. It's on the front of the hull and about a third of the way down the flanks. It's on the front of the turret and again a little bit down the sides. So the back of the tank is very vulnerable, the roof and the belly extremely vulnerable. So those are the areas you're going to try to hit, which will result in an M kill, as in it's not going to move anywhere, and then you can follow it up and try and destroy the whole tank if need be. But in order to try and keep these rounds now that could come from anywhere, because the battle lines are no longer one in front of another, the enemy can come from any side, tanks are increasingly moving to what's called active protection system. So essentially it's got a munition on the turret itself. So as it detects an incoming round, it fires a bit like a shotgun, just tries to get as much lead in the air as quickly as possible. It will only be a few meters in front of the turret, but hopefully to hit and deflect the round coming in. So if you think, as I've just described, a thin round about 12 inches long, just a big dart, if that suddenly hits another object in the air, a load of metal, it's going to be deflected slightly, and it only needs to be deflected a little bit. Even if it hits the tank, it's not going to get into it, it will just bounce off. So active protection systems on tanks are increasingly coming in to have a go at the round that's coming back at them. Gabriel, you asked about logistics and the logistic tail, as we call it. So you've got your fighting troops at the front, and they need everything that they would have back in camp. So in terms of resupplying them, the logistic tail to supply them with everything from food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, body armour, defensive equipment to build up their trenches or what have you, is all the essential supplies that you'll need every day for operation. Batteries for your radio and your thermal kit and everything else. If you were there, Francis, you'd need an emergency resupply of hair gel and your contact number for the nearest tailor. All this stuff,
hair gel in years, Dom,
needs to be supplied to the front. And it's very difficult. In many ways, the infantry is at the front in a trench with overhead protection and all the sensors out. To a degree, they are relatively safer than what we call the last mile logistics, the poor chaps and chapesses that have to bring this stuff forward. That's where they're extremely vulnerable. So that last bit, the last mile logistics, is increasingly being done by drone, either aerial drone or UGV, unattended ground vehicle, these things that will just trundle along and bring you all your ammunition and water. Because the tail, the logistic tail, think about what you go through in a day, how many times you need to eat, how many times you need to clean yourself and clean your weapon and administer yourself and stay in touch with headquarters with your batteries and all this sort of stuff. Everything that you need to survive here for a day at the Telegraph, and I won't list them, Francis, don't worry, but everything that you need for a day is exactly the same for a soldier, except it's exceptionally difficult to keep them resupplied safely without as well being giving the position away. If all you have to do is stick a drone in the air to watch where all these things are going, then you suddenly find out where the positions are. It doesn't matter how well camouflaged they are. If that's where everything gets dropped off every morning, then you kind of worked out where they are. So it is a very difficult. It's a science and an art, logistics. It's a much underrated area of military activity because it's often not sort of seen as the front end and tanks and all the rest of it. But without logistics, everything comes apart very quickly. The old maxim is amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics.
An army marches on its stomach.
Wow. Okay. Well, I've learned a lot right now. Woo. Okay, Francis, I've got another question for you on the role the US plays, or could play in the war. That's from Cliff in New Zealand. Why would unilateral US acknowledgement of Russian ownership of Crimea matter?
It's a great question. Thanks, Cliff. I think at the end of the day, an acknowledgement formally by the United States that Crimea should be part of Russia would be a vindication of Russia's strategy now for years, and effectively a shift, a move away from the international rules-based order, if we can articulate it as such, to a world where might is right. It is symbolic in that sense that the leader of the free world would be willing to sign a document to see territory that was seized illegally through violence given to the aggressor. So that is why there is so much reluctance, understandably, upon the Ukrainians, but also in Europe generally. The Germans, the Estonians, the British, the French have been very, very punchy on this, to say that Crimea must not be given back as part of any ceasefire proposals or indeed lasting peace settlement. Now, of course, Crimea is seen as a focus because of the annexation and what took place there. In fact, actually, Crimea as a strategic utility for the Russians has been eroded for quite a considerable amount of time now, I'd say at least 2 years, because its navy basically isn't safe there. The weapons that the Ukrainians have mean that they are able to strike the ships there. We've seen many drone swarms that have sunk ships. So Crimea as this sort of linchpin in Russian defence, which is what Putin and others like to see it as, is really no longer the case, I would argue, as would many others. Its significance is sort of historic. Rooted in the Crimean War and this idea of a Novorossiya and the unification of those parts of eastern Ukraine that Russia has long seen as its own. I think, though, we have to be frank about this, which is that Russia doesn't just want Crimea. That's not the key to ending this war, if indeed there is a key to ending this war. They want the entirety of the east of Ukraine. They want those annexed regions in the east. They want Zaporizhia. They want Kherson. They want those territories which they do not currently control. But they nonetheless feel that that is the key for them. And so if there is any movement on this from the Americans, that's when we should really be worried, because you're in a situation then where territory that is not currently in Ukrainian hands could potentially be politically compelled to be given by the Americans or others to try and force some kind of peace deal, because they will potentially believe Moscow when they say that those are the keys for us. And that's what we understand they've been pushing behind closed doors. But when I was in a press briefing, a small one with President Zelensky a few weeks ago, I put this to him. I talked about the occupied territories where people are enduring the most horrific circumstances and resisting as well. It's often forgotten, and resisting. I asked him, is there any deal you could sign that would see territory that is not currently in Russian hands given to Russia? And he said, no, that would not be a peace deal. That would be a capitulation, and a forced capitulation. So that is a chasm there. If Russia, as many believe, are absolutely adamant they have to take all of those regions in the east that they've legally, inverted commas, annexed through their parliament, then this war still has a long way to go, and there's no easy way you can reconcile the two positions there, because I believe the Ukrainians will never, ever give away territory that is not currently in Russian hands, and nor should they, according to international law, nor the interests of America, nor the interests of Europe and the wider West.
I've got two questions on energy and sanctions now. I don't know who wants to go first. So from Brennan, since all that Russia has to sell the world is oil and gas, and the Europeans clearly can never trust them again, I'm quoting, wouldn't one of the most impactful things European countries could do would be to completely remove themselves from the oil and gas economy and fully fund the most immediate transition away from those 20th century energy sources? That's question one. And then question two, which is more or less on the same subject, from Paul in Sweden. What do you think might be the economic and political consequences for Europe if the US apply harsh secondary sanctions on countries who buy Russian energy? Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll have a stab. Thanks for the question. Thanks, Brennan. Russia still makes so much money through its oil and gas sector, but not so much to Europe. I mean, it really has tightened up. There's still some coming through for various boring bureaucratic reasons, but it's dwindled almost to nothing. It's just a trickle now. But you've got the likes of India, who are still buying a huge amount of oil from Russia, and elsewhere as well. We talked about the shadow fleet many times on the podcast, so we know this stuff's being shipped around the world. So sanctions are good but flawed. We've had many conversations with Stephanie Baker. She's brilliant on this, about the whole sanctions regime and how relatively easy, if you put the effort into it, you can get around. It's by no means easy, but doable if you want to, and Russia does want to a certain degree. So it's very difficult to completely cut it off. But Russia makes virtually no money now from the West. That really has been cut off. As for our future, in energy sovereignty, energy dependence on others, it's a massive hot topic at the moment. America's massively expanded its LNG, so it's liquefied natural gas sector, because largely on the back of all the fracking. But if you have a look down the eastern seaboard of the US, go around Jacksonville and these kind of places, and have a look at some of these terminals that are, they're not being built. They are they are well and truly built now. America would love to be able to supply LNG or to dominate the European market, and I think for a little while now we're sort of in the realm of, well, who would you rather give your money to? Because we are some way away from wind, solar, nuclear, and tide power, providing everything we need here in the UK, and Europe's the same. But those are the four areas we're particularly looking at. So I think in the short term at least, for which I mean 20 years probably, we've got to pick who do we want to be dependent upon for our energy. And I'm afraid I would much rather be dependent upon the US than Russia for our energy needs right now. Longer term, yeah, if we could be energy independent with, as I say, nuclear, solar, tide and wind, terrific, but we are some way off that at the moment.
Just one thing on that colliery question about what would the consequences be of secondary sanctions. Of course, this is what Senator Lindsey Graham in the United States and others are pushing for. So this idea that there would be sanctions put not only on Russia that would be tightened up from the United States in order to try and compel Russia to negotiate, but also that those other countries that are currently buying that, which Dom alluded to there, they'd suffer too. And that would be the key to finally bringing Russia to the table. I mean, I think, it's a noble aim, but I just don't think that following the pretty disastrous tariffs policy that the White House has enacted, that they are going to feel they have the clout to enforce that, for one, nor will they be wanting to squeeze the markets yet further. I think that ship may well have sailed. But who knows, if there really is a desire in the White House to bring this war to a close, that would be one of the things that could be done pretty quickly that would see a massive impact in the short term, that would see Russia bleeding money. And I think it is important to underscore that most experts do believe that the war economy that Putin has created is not sustainable forever. Now, we don't know the timescale of when we would begin to really see a serious fraying. Many people think that they couldn't go beyond 2025, but people have been overly optimistic before. But nonetheless, this is a serious, serious thing. And if the United States doesn't, in essence, bail out Russia by easing on sanctions, I think there are reasons to be optimistic that the key could well be the economy rather than anything else.
This is all fascinating. I've still got a few more questions in the bag for you two.
Go for it.
Dom, Jeremy from the USA wonders why the air defense against missiles and drones is so poor for Ukraine and so strong for Israel.
Okay, two reasons. Firstly, geography. So Israel's much smaller. It's much more able to have all its areas covered and overlapping. You never want to just have one system, one bubble of air defence covering something over here and another coming over there, because guess where the cruise missiles are going to go? They'll go down the middle bit where they're not covered. So you need to have overlapping arcs, basically. But Israel is much smaller. Ukraine is massive, as we've discovered when we've taken many trains across that country. It is a very, very big place.
For many hours.
So it's very difficult to... you simply can't protect on a country that size. It's almost impossible to protect everywhere all the time against all natures of ammunition coming your way. You'd just bankrupt yourself. There was a Michael Howard, the famous British military historian. He said, you can't be right when you're trying to build a military. You can't be right because there are so many threats, so many things you do need to spend your money on, that you'll just bankrupt the entire country trying to protect against everything. He said the answer is not to try to be right. The answer is to try to be not so far wrong that when the threat reveals itself, you can't quickly adjust what you've got that's good enough and then face the threat that's coming your way. So you're never going to be able to protect against everything, and Ukraine is that sort of statement, that sentiment writ large. It's an enormous country, and air defence missiles are very expensive, very sophisticated, so it's just very difficult to get enough of them into the country to be able to defend everywhere. As soon as the air defence goes to Kyiv, we then saw that ballistic missile, Oreshkin, the nuclear missile that then hit the Dnipro. So if you move your air defence to the Dnipro, then Kharkiv will get hit, and then Kherson and something else. So there's no point in trying to cover everywhere all the time. You need to have another solution to not having that threat coming your way.
That reminds me, John, sorry to interrupt you. Just that when that happened, I remember we were in Ukraine at the time, and somebody turned to me in the bomb shelter and said, a Ukrainian, you must be count yourselves very lucky and honoured that you're in Ukraine when the first intercontinental ballistic missile is fired. So shout out to him.
Thanks. The second reason why, taking Jeremy's question a little bit further, why external supporters of Ukraine, the West for want of easy shorthand, so much more readily protecting the skies of Israel than Ukraine, i.e. we've seen the United States Air Force, the Royal Air Force, others, not just using missiles, but physically in the air in jets with pilots, putting skin in the game, putting men and women in harm's way. It's all down to this fear of escalation with Putin. I mean, I asked at least 2 defence secretaries, why are you prepared to commit the RAF into action to defend the skies of Israel but not Ukraine? Got a very elegant, totally fudged and unsatisfactory answer. Yeah, it's simply that they just don't want to put their men and women in harm's way against Russia and run the risk of having somebody shot down and then, is it an Article 5 moment, or do you not care about your people? It's not an Article 5 moment. So it's just easier to do nothing. But it's a very good question to ask, is why are you prepared to put men and women in harm's way protecting Israel but not Ukraine?
One very, very quick thing to add to that, though, is that as part of the coalition of the willing proposals, the more robust ones from Britain and France, it would see Britain and France in particular involved in a so-called Sky Shield. So potentially, if there is a ceasefire deal on the table and it's been signed, as it were, that they would potentially shoot missiles out of the sky that would be fired by Russia. That is one of the things being actively considered. That would be significant.
It would indeed. Okay, Francis, let's change subjects and go back and look at Europe a little bit. We've talked a lot about the Ukrainian refugees across the continent. There's about 6 million of them since the beginning of the war. Daniel from Ireland asks, what would the result be in terms of helping Ukraine, both economically and in terms of military manpower, if these people return to Ukraine?
Well, I think that's a really good question. From the Ukrainians' perspective, they see it as being essential that for their long-term future, for demographic reasons, as well as for just generally reviving a country that's suffered so much, they think it's essential to bring those people back. And of course, the longer a war goes on, the more difficult that is, because people forge different lives in different countries, and so it is a real problem, a real conundrum that they face. And I think that they understand that in order for people to want to return home, whether it be young men, young women, there have to be security guarantees in place that mean Ukraine is a peaceful country, that people feel there can be safe to raise families, will be a good place for investment, and more fundamentally is a place that isn't going to erupt into a war in the next 5 or 10 years. So President Zelensky is certainly very aware of that, and it's a very, very serious problem that if we are left in a unsatisfactory limbo, purgatory, that's very, very bad, very serious for Ukraine for those reasons, because it is less likely that those refugees will return home, and that has big, big consequences for Ukraine's population density and for the kind of country it can be. You know, if we want to see a Ukraine that is integrated with Europe, that is dynamic, that transforms this is a drone superpower. This is very much a place that is at the cutting edge of 21st century warfare. If we want that to be part of our family rather than Russia's, then we need to be thinking about ensuring that Ukraine becomes a country that people want to return home to.
Do you think if Ukraine were to join the EU, that would entice people to go back?
I think probably it would, yes, because it would be that further economic integration. And I think many Ukrainians believe that if they do become members of the European Union, that there isn't a security guarantee there, but there is more of a sense of, hang on a minute, it's a very different beast from Russia's perspective attacking a European Union power than it is a power that is, as it were, an independent state but isn't part of the EU or NATO. So I think that would have a consequence, if only in a kind of symbolic sense, as opposed to a on the dotted line, there's an Article 5-esque thing here that would be transformative.
And we hear a lot whenever we've spoken with Ukrainian refugees in the UK, for example, how like the perspective of going back is made harder the longer this conflict runs on. For like children who've been uprooted, who are not necessarily able to study Ukrainian at school, who are forgetting Ukrainian little and little, and people who've just like rebuilt their entire lives. It's just a really hard move to think about uprooting your life once more in just the span of a few years, isn't it?
Just to say, I went to St Mary's Ukrainian School here in London very recently, one of the special episodes that we did for Easter. And speaking to children there is definitely a desire to go home, to rebuild. And these are children, bear in mind, who've been here for 3 years. And 3 years is a long, long time when you're that age. They still want to go back, but they have no illusions about what world they might be returning to. And they want to return to a country that they feel they can contribute to and that is safe. And who can blame them, given the vicious manner in which Putin has conducted this war and continues every day to attack civilian targets? It's beyond comprehension, really, the scale of this.
Okay, 2 more questions. One that I've saved for the end because, Francis, you will love it.
Okay.
It's from Finn.
I think I will as well.
I think you will as well, but Francis is definitely...
Is it Napoleon related?
Not quite, but trust me on this. It's from Finn in Australia.
Good day.
Oh, God.
I'm not going to try and do an Australian accent. That is beyond me. I'm
Sorry,
doing my
Finn,
best
sorry.
already.
Serious.
Okay. In this time of collapsing global institutions and unprecedented uncertainty, have you, meaning both of you as individuals and as Brits, considered the possible revitalisation of the Commonwealth as an economic and political bloc?
The Commonwealth. Yes. Great question. So I think... where to start on this? At the end of the day, we, being Britain, we being a sense of what remains of the collective West, because I don't think we can necessarily see the United States as a reliable partner in that anymore, need to be looking for organisations beyond NATO for our collective defence. And indeed, I would argue, to the European Union. The reason for NATO is because of there being certain unreliable partners in there, and I don't need to name them, but the same is true of the EU. Slovakia and Hungary could, if in extremis, block certain essential measures for European defence in the long term. They have that veto. And so the EU, whilst it is, not controlling the defence apparatus of Europe, it is still a key entity for those kind of conversations, sanctions on Russia, certain weapons programmes and things like that. They are in a powerful position to have leverage over, which could have disastrous consequences. So I am not saying that the Commonwealth is the way out of this, I'm afraid, Finn, but it is, I think, a really great question to be thinking, what bodies are there where you can bring powers together where there may not be some of those limitations on action because of unreliable members. Now, the Commonwealth has its own unreliable members, and let's face it, the ties between the countries are pretty loose. But as avenues for dialogue, Commonwealth, great, why not? And Jeff as well, which is something I know that Dom's spoken about many times on the podcast, is another entity that might offer a way for there to be new alliances formed of countries that are willing to be more unified and have a sense of robustness there. But my instinct is that it's going to take some time, and it may well need to be a new entity altogether that is the willing countries within the so-called coalition of the willing. Because at the moment, there are too many in there, and it's making it feel a bit more like a coalition of the unwilling. So I think there's going to be another entity that comes out of this potentially.
Okay. Dom, your thoughts on the Commonwealth?
I don't have many thoughts on the Commonwealth. I think it's a hangover, obviously, of the the E word that we dare not speak. Unless and until there's a head of the Commonwealth that's not British, then I think it would just bumble along as it is. Doesn't really do an awful lot. It would be a very powerful political statement if the head of the Commonwealth was no longer the monarch from Britain, that might then actually galvanise people into thinking, oh, well, maybe this is a progressive, forward-thinking, modern and relevant organisation. But I think as it is at the moment, it's not really. It doesn't wield much power. It's okay. It's a nice way of being able to talk to some parts of the world that wouldn't ordinarily pop up in the G7s or in the this, that, and the other. But actually, you can do that anytime you like. That's why we have embassies and ambassadors and all that kind of stuff. So I don't really think it's I don't think it's a very. I wouldn't put much stock in it, Finn. I'd put your cash elsewhere. Jeff, the Joint Expeditionary Force, the 10-nation sort of Northern European, the gang of beer drinkers rather than wine drinkers, essentially, those that will turn up on day one of a fight, they're pretty good. But again, it's kind of hard political power. I look to other places for modern relevance and a way of channeling sentiment, a way of sort of reaching and expressing the views of us, society, to those that lead us. And I look at something like calm down, Francis, calm down. But Eurovision is a great way of. I mean, it's a political animal. No matter what anyone says, it is riddled with politics. And that is, I think, I've looked at that as a really interesting way of taking the barometer of where international sentiment is. And I think there's other bits and pieces like that. So I'd buy Eurovision and sell Commonwealth.
Nil point.
This is not where I thought this conversation was going to take us, I will admit, from the Commonwealth to Eurovision. Okay, one final question for the two of you. From a listener named Eugene, whose earnest and self-deprecating message really made me smile. He says, my question to you is, what can an unfit, indebted, and very average middle-aged Westerner, so not me, like me, do to ensure that tyrants like Putin do not win, and by that I mean lose definitively?
Thanks, Eugene. So what can we do? Well, it depends. I mean, if you want to spend money, there are a number of. You've got to be careful, obviously, supporting charities. But we interview many occasions charities that we have checked out. We don't just allow anyone onto the pod. So if people come onto our podcast, then I think you'll be pretty safe if you want to bung them a few bucks. We've had the likes of Save Ukraine, Mykola Kuleba, who is the Children's Commissioner for Ukraine, who is leading the effort to get the 19,000, is it, we think?
Well, that number hasn't been updated for two years,
Okay.
So I think it's many thousands more.
Many thousands, many double-digit thousands of children kidnapped, let's not beat around the bush, by Russia. Children taken to Russia or to Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. So that's Save Ukraine. Mykola Kuleba, you'll be able to find him online. Who else have we spoken to? GP Now, a great bunch who provide online medical services for Ukrainians who have left the country or people who are still in the country, including people in the occupied territories if they're able to. GP Now is a good bunch. Ukrainian Action, if you wanted to support veteran rehabilitation, good bunch. I'm actually moderating they've helped produce a film called Taras about a guy who was a Ukrainian snowboarder called Taras. He went to fight and he was damaged emotionally, mentally damaged by the war, and he's now gone back to the Carpathian Mountains of Ukraine, the far west, to seek solace and rest his mind and recuperate. They made a film, and I'd be moderating the Q&A panel on Wednesday, 7th of May, at the Bloomsbury, the Curzon Cinema in Bloomsbury. You'll be able to find that online. I'm going to put something out, I think, on my social media in the next few days. But Ukrainian Action supporting rehabilitation for veterans and others that we've spoken to. So that's if you want to spend cash. If you don't want to do that, or you're not in a position to do that, then I think the best thing to do is to stay informed, stay up to date, maintain your balance in debate, challenge nonsense where you see or hear it, talk to your family, friends, colleagues, and above all, because we're nowhere near the end of this thing, folks, find somehow, if you can, but keep looking for it, find and maintain equilibrium. Just stay content. And I don't necessarily mean happy. If you can achieve happiness, that's brilliant. But contentment, I think, is what we should be aiming for. I'm afraid this isn't a sometimes not a very nice world. So we have to be content that there are very bad people, very nasty people who are not just surviving but are going to be thriving. Right? They're out there. But when I look at Russian oligarchs and I see Putin's coterie of thugs and all the rest of it, there's a reason they send their kids to private school in London, and they have their mistress in Cap d'Antibes, and they have their yacht, if it's not been seized, in the Caribbean. It's because, for most people, living in Russia is a pretty grim place. So they know that it's nicer outside. That's where we are. Even though we see people with more money than a Dearnley on a good day at the races, I'm afraid we're going to have to live with that. But let's just ignore it. Let's just ignore it and be nice to each other, nice together, have our own little community, find our own peace and equilibrium, and we will get through this.
What words to end on. Thank you. Thank you both for continuing to make sense of this awful war for us. And well done. It's lots of questions. Thank you to our listeners and to people on the internet for listening and watching wherever you are in the world. This was the first of Ukraine, the latest, the Q&A, first of many, no doubt. We'll continue to answer your questions in our weekly newsletter. Look out for the sign-up link in the description to the episode. And if it's the first time that you watch us, check out our show, Ukraine the Latest, where every weekday we talk about the latest developments in the war, both on the battlefields and in the diplomatic arena, and do in-depth interviews on topics related to Ukraine and the war. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adley.
Thank you.